I'm There we go. You did it. I'm so proud of you. Yeah, so today we're going to be chatting about accessibility. And as Jonathan mentioned, I would love for this to be very conversational. And part of the reason for that is that accessibility, as we'll see, is a very big subject, very broad umbrella. And there's no way I can make you an expert in what, like 45 minutes or so. So instead, my goal today is to get you thinking like an accessibility practitioner. We're going to kind of start to see how accessibility practitioners would begin to test and fix websites, but this isn't going to be a completely comprehensive guide. And I think honestly, it'll be so much better and richer for all of us if you have thoughts to add on something, just feel free to like unmute and say, or if you prefer, add your comments in the chat. Kind of pose questions, answer questions. Let's like really, I think that this will be best if we just make this very, very conversational. So that is kind of my request. So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen, and instantly I have to do the whole Zoom tango of rearranging the windows so that I can actually see people and my screen. All right. So I also wanted to shout out, I have a bit of a landing page for people who want to see some of the resources that we will see today. I've just put a link in the chat, but if you go to benmyers.dev/fCC, you'll be taken to a site that I've got that has some links that we'll be looking at today. So this way, if you see something you like today and you want to be able to get to it later, just go to here. Just go to benmyers.dev/fCC and you'll end up here. And I'll make sure to like add more stuff to this after this is done. And if the recording goes up on like YouTube and whatnot, I'll even add the embed and whatnot. So benmyers.dev/fCC. Cool. So a bit about myself kind of before we get in. I'm Ben. I've been a full-time web developer for 4 years. I'm currently working at Microsoft, specifically on Microsoft Docs, which is the developer documentation. I'm working on building the platform that Docs site lives on. So anytime you see the general Docs interface, I have a hand in that. And we on the Docs team, we care a lot about various concerns that just involve making sure everyone can use the Docs, from things like accessibility to performance to internationalization and beyond. It's truly just such a fun experience to learn from, and I'm constantly learning how to make websites more usable for people. Prior to Microsoft, I was at USAA, where I was a React developer there. And that was where I really got my start in accessibility. And we'll talk about that some as well. I like to blog about accessibility. The benmyers.dev link is actually my blog. I write a lot about accessibility, and I would love it if you could give some of these a read sometimes. But that's one of the things I do. The other thing I do is I host a weekly stream called Some Antics. You can see the landing page for that at Some Antics Dev. The site's brand new. But basically, every week I bring on guests from around web development and web design to teach me something about building great user experiences for the web in a hands-on way, with a focus on accessibility and core web technologies like HTML, CSS, JavaScript. This is a Twitch stream, so you can actually go to twitch.tv/semanticsdev and follow that. And I have to quickly pause that before it starts blaring. It would probably start blaring jazz music, as that's my intro music. So that's a bit about me and kind of just some of the things that I do. And as you can see, like accessibility is this constant like undercurrent in the stuff that I do. It's something that I'm very passionate about, and it's something that I'm very passionate about sharing with other people. So I'm super excited to be here with y'all today to talk about that. And kind of before we get started, I want to get a feel for where y'all are at. So let's start with maybe kind of a basic question, but I kind of want to see where you guys take this. So my question is, and feel free to respond to this in the chat or by unmuting, feel free to add to what other people are saying. What is web accessibility? What does that mean to you? Ooh, crickets.
Yeah, I know, right? What does it mean? I mean making it feels like this is self-explanatory, making it accessible for people who I guess to more people than just, I don't know, I feel like we kind of think of things like from our own perspective most of the time, and we don't actively think about the fact that there are people trying to use the web that might not do things the way we do. So yeah, exactly how Darren said, making content that's available to everyone. That's way better than what I was saying.
All right. Anyone have anything they want to add to that? That's fine. Yeah. So my next question then is, what are some things y'all have heard about accessibility? And kind of what have you heard about doing accessibility work?
I wouldn't really say that I've heard anything necessarily. That's actually why this meeting looked appealing to me in the first place. Is I was like, oh my gosh, I've never even thought about this before. But the first things that really come to my mind is that color blindness runs pretty deep in my gene pool, and so in my mind, that's sort of the first place I think of when I think of accessibility on websites. Is if you make anything color dependent, you're almost certain to run into an issue somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if y'all have heard the stats on colorblindness, but I want to say like 8% of men have some form of colorblindness. Most commonly red-green colorblind. And I think it's something like 1 in 200 women. But like, especially like if we're thinking like 8% of men, like that's a not insubstantial population there. And especially if they're most commonly red-green colorblind, think about forms, right? And how red and green are kind of the colors that we express, like form error versus validity. And to many people, they may not be able to discern a difference between those colors, right? So color blindness is absolutely a factor of that. It's something that we will absolutely talk about today. Yeah, I want to call out some of the things that are being said in the chat. So folks have heard that accessibility might be hard, or that might not be something that you have time for. People are hearing that it's connected to compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Laurette's mentioning screen readers. Absolutely. So these are things that y'all have heard about, or it sounds like for many of us, maybe we're even starting at a ground level of like, oh my gosh, this had never even occurred to me, right? So good to kind of see where we're at, I think, on this base level. So let's talk about this. For me, the definition of web accessibility I use, and I'll be going off of today, is ensuring that websites are usable for disabled people. I think that there are definitions that extend usability to everyone, and I think that that is great. But I like focusing on disabled people for accessibility because I think oftentimes they disabled people can be kind of left out of the thought process. They're when we come to development from like an able-bodied perspective, we often are assuming that users are like us, and that's maybe the worst assumption you could ever make in design, is assuming that your user is like you, or that you are like your user. But this often means that we can inadvertently create access barriers for disabled people. And disabled people very often have to adapt how they navigate the web, sometimes using alternative means, sometimes using alternative devices or software. By the way, we call any tool that a disabled person's using to basically navigate the world, we call that assistive technology. So that's a term I'm going to use a lot today. It's a very broad category because assistive technology can refer to hardware, it can refer to software, it can be operating system settings, but broadly speaking, anything that like the disabled person's using to facilitate navigating the world in any way is assistive technology. And so a big part of web accessibility that we're going to see is ensuring compatibility with assistive technology. So accessibility in kind of its distilled summary here is usability for disabled people. And this matters in particular because disabled people very often have to use kind of these like alternate devices. And they have alternate needs that, like, if we're not thinking about them, we can inadvertently exclude them. So that's what we'll be doing today, is specifically focusing on how do we make the web more accessible for disabled people. Any kind of questions or thoughts on that? Anything y'all want to add kind of before we get going or keep going? Making sure I'm keeping an eye on the chat as well.
I have one.
Go ahead.
So obviously I know about the Chrome Lighthouse telling me different things that I could do better. I was just wondering, do you have other resources that are pretty good in terms of like helping us improve in this area?
That's a great question. We will totally get to that. One of the ones I want to highlight, and we will highlight this down the road, is a tool called Axe DevTools. It's in fact one of the links I've got here. That's one of the ones I use. We will talk about automated tools and just tooling in general for surfacing accessibility issues. I want to kind of put a pin in that and get back to it like closer to the end, though, if that's all right. But great question. Fantastic question. So when we're talking about accessibility being usable, like usability for disabled people, I think it's really important to understand the spectrum of disability that exists out there in the world. And so this is going to seem like maybe a bit of a silly exercise, but I would love it if you could bear with me on this, because I think this is going to really help us frame our conversation going forward. I would love, you can do this in the chat or unmuting, either way. I would love it if we could just all collectively name a bunch of disabilities that we know of, things that we've heard of. You know, we've already mentioned colorblindness, for instance. What are some other disabilities that y'all know of? Just straight up blindness. Yeah, absolutely, Clint. Motor impairment, okay. Folks are getting their typing fingers going. Hearing impairment, I can relate. So I myself am hard of hearing. I have a hearing aid on, so I can definitely relate to that. Where are some other ones? Yeah, quadriplegic, paraplegic, various forms of paralysis, absolutely. Yeah, neurological, cognitive disabilities for sure. Any others? Good deal. So very often when we want to think about disability, it's helpful for us to categorize disability into several types. And this helps us kind of break down access needs in various ways. So we'll typically break down disability into 4 categories, at least as far as web development is concerned. So the first category is visual disabilities. So this could be something like full blindness, but also low vision, and low vision comes in many forms, right? Your vision just fades as you age, but also you can get like cataracts and stuff like that. Or you could have an astigmatism. There's also color blindness, as we've talked about. So various disabilities that impact your ability to see. There's hearing disabilities. So we talked about just like hearing impairment. I'm hard of hearing. You could also be full deaf. There's also auditory processing disorders, which are where you can hear content, but your ability to like understand what's being said, like to like make meaning, make sense out of what's being heard, is impacted. Auditory processing disorders can be disabilities in their own right, or they could be symptoms of something larger, like I believe autism, for instance. There's your various motor disabilities. So these could be things like, you know, limb abnormalities, such as like what I've got. My arms are a little shorter and bent inwards, and I'm missing thumbs. There's, you know, we've mentioned like paraplegia, quadriplegia, etc., various forms of paralysis. You could also, for instance, have Parkinson's or arthritis, for instance. And then the fourth category is cognitive disabilities. And this is a really big, broad category. It includes learning disabilities, such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, which is like dyslexia, but for numbers. There's dysgraphia, I think is one as well. Then there's disabilities that impact like your memory, for instance, like short-term memory loss, all of these things, right? They all have the capacity to impact how you navigate the world and how you navigate the web. So accessibility, this is one of the things that makes like accessibility kind of hard to like distill into a single hour, is because there's so many forms of disability and everyone experiences their disability in different ways. No two disabled people are the same. Disabled groups are not monoliths. And people have like, even people with similar disabilities will have very different preferences and access needs, etc. In addition, when you're thinking about people who have disabilities, it's very tempting to assume that like, oh, we could talk about like a blind person, but very often people with disabilities actually have like multiple disabilities, and these disabilities all intersect with each other in different ways. And any one of these has the ability to impact how someone experiences your website. And so accessibility is really an exercise in empathy, of understanding all the different kinds of people that can exist in the world, and making sure that we're not creating barriers for them, and making sure that we're meeting their access needs. So what are some ways that some of the disabilities that we mentioned might impact someone's experience of a page? I'm going to call on Jonathan.
I mean, I'm thinking maybe just like even on their phone, when it's hard to, there's not a big like tap area, and so it's hard to get a hold of
Yeah.
something. Kind of like how Clint is talking right now. Hard to read small text, obviously, like color issues. Yeah, it's a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. The like, the tap areas is a huge thing, especially on mobile, where, it can be trendy to have like small icon buttons or whatever. But if you think about it, like I would not consider, like, I don't typically have issues using my touchscreen, but even still, like, it's really easy for me to like, fudge clicking something and accidentally click the thing to the right of it. And you can imagine how, if you have to click a small hit area, but you have Parkinson's, for instance, how that could be much harder, right? It like, that precision is not something you can necessarily rely on. Hard to read small text, absolutely. That is, something that, like, if you have a form of low vision, if your vision's blurry, for instance, that can be a challenge to make out smaller text, right? Can't tab through the page, wonky hover drop downs. Absolutely. These are ways in which, so yeah, these are ways in which your disability could impact your experience of the page. I wanted to propose a couple of others. So let me look up real quick. I want to show y'all I'm just gonna pull up W3 schools here. And we're gonna take a look. I want to look at like just one pattern here, which is one that we'll have seen a whole lot, which is the placeholder for a field, right? So we've all seen this pattern before. It's a fairly common one. You start typing into the field, right, and the placeholder goes away. Let's take a look at like specifically this interaction and see if we can come up with some ways in which this pattern may pose an access barrier for disabled people. Yeah, I guess I should have like more strongly worded that as a question. What are some ways that this pattern might pose a problem for, some disabled people?
You mean
given the chat. Oh, go ahead.
You mean the pattern to like like the format that it's asking for, or
I mean, just placeholders in general, right? Like placeholders for like input fields. So this idea of like we have some text in here, and then when you start typing in it, that text goes away.
You had mentioned short-term memory loss earlier.
I'm sorry, I
Maybe-
can't
maybe
quite
there's
make
like
out what
a-
you just said there.
I said you'd mentioned short-term memory loss earlier. I don't know
Yeah.
if it'd be that extreme of a case, but that
It
comes to mind.
absolutely can be. Yeah, like this is, if you think about it, it's disappearing context, right? And so oftentimes what you'll see is like in uber minimalist sites, they'll get rid of like the label and they'll just use like the placeholder as a label. But the moment you start typing into this, you lose the context as to what the field's supposed to be about. In this case, you would lose the example, right? And so if there's nothing else indicating, like like here we've got this label right here, but if there's nothing else indicating what this is for, you can basically forget what it is you were doing, like a sim walking into a room and then like walking out, like walking into the bathroom with a plate of burnt toast, not sure what they were trying to do there. Like it's incredibly, for people with short-term memory loss, like yeah, disappearing context is absolutely a problem. Darren calls out the contrast. Absolutely, right? So to indicate the text is placeholder text, we usually style it as like really light gray. But the problem with really light gray is that that can be hard to read, particularly for people with low vision issues, right? So this is a pattern that, some people might not even be able to see what's in here. And then if you darken the gray to the point where it is readable, then it might be so dark that you could mistake it for the filled in text. Like if I fill this in, is it really that easy to tell when it's in there or not? Like that can be really tricky. So color contrast is absolutely an issue here, making sure that the text that we have stands out against the background and stands out from alternate states, right? So these are ways in which a common pattern that we use could pose access barriers for some disabled people. So yeah, this is kind of the goal here of here we go, of accessibility, is taking these web patterns and understanding like how does this actually impact like a disabled person going through this experience, and seeing if you can come up with alternate strategies or ways to improve this. We might look at this and go, okay, not everyone will be able to see the placeholder, and people might forget what's in the placeholder. So we probably shouldn't be using the placeholder for anything critical, right? Like this should be basically if it gets lost, if it's not there at all, it shouldn't be the end of the world, right? So a sample format might be something that we're okay losing in a way, right? But then some people instead will opt to just straight up remove the placeholder, just go, it's not worth it whatsoever. This is a pattern that we can't seem to fix. And that's okay too, right? So accessibility practitioners are taking a look at the web sites that we use and seeing these kinds of patterns and figuring out how, disabled people would experience this. So yeah. So the web that we build has the capacity to introduce barriers for disabled people. So I know we're kind of making this like just very, very conversational. It's a whole lot of like, hey, look what's wrong. But I wanted to spend some time actually doing this in a like less guided way, perhaps. I built a site that is riddled with accessibility issues. I've shared a link to this in the chat. And I'll kind of show my screen on Zoom and go through the site. But also, if you wanted to pull this up on your own and take a look at it as well, feel free. I'd love to just, spend some time seeing if we can indicate anything on the site that we think might be an accessibility issue. You're welcome, Jonathan. You are welcome. This is very much so a prototype site. So like all of these links all take you to the same pizza recipe. That's just because this is a demo site. But yeah, just kind of, I took a template that I found online on a website called html.design, and I adapted it to be less accessible. So yeah, just what are some things that y'all notice as I kind of go through this site? Or if you go through this site?
When you try to tab through it, it doesn't show you anything. I think it is tabbing, but
Yeah,
it's
so
not.
let me start sharing my screen. There's a lot that's hard to read on your phone right now. It's not just on your phone. It's just plain hard to read. Yeah, so I'm gonna so I mentioned assistive technologies. One paradigm that people might use to navigate the page, particularly if they can't see your page or if they can't use a mouse, for instance, because mice are precision tools and not everyone is capable of using a precision tool very well. Some people will use keyboard navigation. So they'll exclusively use your page with the keyboard. So on many sites, if I go here, for instance, to my site, I can tab through. And you should see in the bottom left, like I've got a little program that's giving you my keystrokes. I can tab through and you can always see like where my keyboard is, right? Like I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. If I go onto, this site right here, right? Like similar story. You can always see where the keyboard is. But here, if I, come to this site and I tab, you can actually see that in the I guess you can't see it necessarily, but like my keyboard navigation, like it is moving. It is going places. It's just that you can't always see where it is. Like the little status bar in the bottom left is showing you like it's so hard to see the little status bar, but you can see that I've got like a hyperlink that I would go to, but like it is so hard to tell where my cursor is. And this is because on the site, I've employed a tactic that you'll often see. Designers don't often like the little focus outlines that show up when you tab through the page. They think it's ugly. And so very often they'll be like, hey, can you turn that off? And if I go to the CSS, you'll see I've actually, where did I do it? I did it somewhere. Here we go. You can see I've actually disabled the outline here. And so that's harmful, right? If someone is dependent on navigating the page with their keyboard, they can't see they can't see where they are, right? It's kind of akin to like hiding the mouse cursor. You wouldn't do that. That would be outrageous. So yeah, if I fix that and if I go to, I've actually got this like locally, and I go here, you can now see it's not always great to see, but like there is the default focus outline that Chrome provides here. And it's now a little easier to see like how to go through the site. So it's, we could still spend time making this more prominent, right? But like it is at very least better. So yeah. Another thing is that it's very hard to read the text, right? This white text has very poor contrast against the image behind it. We could employ various different techniques to improve this, right? We could add, one trick I like seeing is like, folks will do like a translucent black background against this, and that'll allow the text to like stand out whilst not like completely hiding the image behind it. That's a technique that I like. That you could do, but yeah, this isn't standing out very well. If I go to any of the posts, yeah, like especially like over here, the like breadcrumbs, like you might have totally missed that there even were breadcrumbs because this is far too light, right? So tons of things. What are some other things that y'all are saying? Carla says that there are red and green labels. Yeah, so over here, so I don't want to make color out to be a problem, right? Like it's totally fine to use color and it's totally fine to even have different colors referring to different categories, for instance. But an important thing to do is to make sure that you have a fallback mechanism for understanding like what that color means. So in this case, yes, we do have green labels and red labels, but the green labels also say veg and the red labels say non-veg, right? So it works because there's an alternate way to make sense of the meaning. Now, if I had just maybe provided a little green circle and a red circle, that would have been a problem, right? Because color alone should not be used as a means of indicating information, but it is totally fine to like, have kind of different colors like this. Yeah. Anything else y'all are finding kind of in this exploratory phase?
Other than the outline, like it just doesn't make a big enough difference. There's not a big enough contrast, but whenever you like hover on things, like that middle red bar,
Yeah.
and when you hover it, like you can barely even tell that you hovered it. And I don't know, I just as a general user, not even like an accessibility thing, like I like to know that the site is active, is live, and that little interaction is just like sends so much
Sure.
security to the user.
Absolutely, right? Like, yeah, you have no way to know, like arguably the placement of this could make it obvious that these are links, but even the hover state's not that prominent. One thing that we could maybe consider is, if we didn't want to change the color all that much, we could, for instance, underline these links, and then if you hover over it, like you remove the underline, right? Is a fairly common thing you could do. And you actually called out this red bar, so I want to show you something here, which is I've talked a bit about color contrast, or we kind of danced around it a bit. And this is actually something that people have figured out math for. We have in the industry, we have kind of acceptable thresholds for color contrast based on the size of text. And you can actually get you can mathematically calculate, we have algorithms for calculating how much contrast there is between text and its background. So I'm going to recommend a tool here called the WebAIM Contrast Checker. Actually, you know what I'm going to recommend? I've got a better tool. It's called Contrast Finder. Here we go. Let me send y'all this link. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to the site here, and I want to actually show y'all something. So let's take the red that we used for this kind of here we go. So this red is this EA3C53. And then the white is just straight up white, I happen to know. So let me just plug this in. We're gonna plug this in. Here we go. So our color is white. Our background is this EA3C53 red. And it tells us that it's failing this ratio of basically 4. So maybe I'll actually do this on Contrast Finder. We'll get on WebAIM Contrast Checker. We'll get a little more information that way. So here we go. Let me swap these. There we go. Okay, so we get this thing called a contrast ratio, which is basically it's nearly 4 to 1, 3.98 to 1. So this is a score that ranges from 1 to 1 all the way to 21 to 1. So 1 to 1 is 0 contrast. You have compared a color to itself. And then 21 to 1 is maximum color contrast. There's only one pair that can give you that contrast. Y'all want to take a guess at what that is?
Was it black and white?
It's black and white. Yep. And so that should give you a sense of kind of where on the scale this falls. And this is I want to say the term for it's like a logarithmic scale or an exponential scale, but once you start going like higher contrast ratio, you'll actually find yourself getting higher and higher quicker. Yes, I do love CCA as well, Darren. That's a great tool. So we have standard thresholds that we need to meet. You'll see that we're failing a few, and then we're actually passing a few. So for all intents and purposes, there's really only 2 thresholds you need to remember. Most text needs to stand out against its background by a ratio of 4.5 to 1. So that's 4.5 to 1. If your text is especially large, like we're talking like heading size usually, and there's definitions for large. but yeah, here we go. There is like an actual definition for large text, but if your text is large enough, then you can qualify for a more lenient threshold, which is 3:1. So in this case, we have a ratio of almost 4:1, but our text, like this text right here, this is, maybe even smaller than regular text size, right? Like this is too small to qualify for the 3:1 ratio. So instead we have to meet a 4.5:1 ratio. And so how would we go about doing that? In my experience, the easiest thing to do is to basically, so contrast, like the most significant factor for contrast is comparing the relative lightness of the two colors. Like, is one color lighter and brighter than the other? So if we've got white, the best thing to do to ensure that our red stands out, because we can't go any brighter than white, so we have to change the red. The best thing to do to make sure the red stands out is actually to darken it. It turns out, if I slide this down a bit, we can actually get there pretty quickly. This color is not that radically different from where we started, right? It's like, let me plug this in. Let me go in here. Let's see. It was EA3, right? Yeah. Here we go. Like if I plug this color in instead, and let me zoom out of the way. Like, so here's what we started with, and when I refresh it, that technically meets it, right? Like that was a minimal change. So sometimes you can just do very minimal things like that to kind of get in the clear. So that's one way to fix an accessibility issue. Color contrast issues are incredibly common. 30% of automatically detectable accessibility issues are color contrast issues. As you can see, we were able to fix it just by picking a slightly different color. If you have kind of bigger challenges, like maybe your colors are further apart, and so you want to have a little more robust approach for figuring out colors, I recommend Contrast Finder, because I've plugged in my two colors that weren't making it. I can click find valid colors, and it'll give me a whole, here we go. I have to say edit the background color. It'll give me a whole host of very similar colors. As you can see, like these reds are not very different at all. Whereas if I had gone, if I had said like F3, 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 right? This is a very light gray. It's gonna have to like darken it up by a lot, and it's like, nah, that's not good enough, right? Not close enough. Maybe if I had said like 999, let's see if this works. There we go. Yeah, so it's like recommending some like very similar colors and stuff like that. So I like a tool like this. This is easily something to have in your toolkit. So Contrast Finder, fantastic. Huge fan. Because it can recommend alternatives. Cool. Yeah, so one thing I wanted to do, I know we are kind of running close to time, is I wanted to demo, actually, I've basically got two more things I want to show. So first of all, I want to show you using a screen reader. And then second of all, I want to show you all automatic detection of accessibility issues, because we can manually go in and test for a lot of accessibility issues. But I mean, oftentimes it's just easier to surface a lot of them ahead of time with automated tools. And we'll talk about kind of what issues can you surface ahead of time and what not with automated tools versus what's manual. But first I want to show y'all how to use a screen reader, because this is something that we don't see a whole lot, but is an incredibly vital part of accessibility testing. It's a vital part of how many people navigate the web. So it should become part of your repertoire. Like if you're releasing a feature for a website, you should also be testing it with a screen reader. So a screen reader, that word is difficult for me to say. A screen reader is a piece of software that will announce the contents of whatever application the user is using out loud, including the various semantics of that application. And so you think about, like, in terms of a web page, like they'll tell you not just like what text is on the web page, but also the fact that, such and such thing is a link or a button or an image, right? And it gives users extra ways to navigate the page. So if you're on a Mac, there is a built-in screen reader called VoiceOver. If you're on Windows, you're very likely using the folks who use Windows will be using either Narrator, NVDA, or JAWS. Narrator comes built into Windows. NVDA is a free open source screen reader, and then JAWS is the paid product that a lot of people still end up using because it's got a lot of history behind it. So I'm on a Mac, so I'll be using VoiceOver to demo things. The keybinds that I give you are VoiceOver specific. They don't translate to every screen reader, but every screen reader will have these general sets of features. And so as you're testing, you should figure out how to do this with your specific screen reader. That said, the way that I will turn on VoiceOver is I just hit Command Space to open up my Spotlight search. I'll type in accessibility here. And it's going to pop up in a bit. It takes a bit of time sometimes. Let's see here. Where's my accessibility settings? Are they all right up? Be weird if they were. Oh, here we go. Yeah, they are up. Okay. So yeah, here's my accessibility window. I went to VoiceOver, and now I will check enable VoiceOver.
VoiceOver on system preferences, accessibility window.
Can y'all hear that? Like when it started talking, were you all able to hear that? Cool. So all right. Now that we're here, before you ever turn on a screen reader, you should always learn what your escape hatches are, because I've encountered numerous people who have turned on a screen reader for the first time and then it started yammering at them and they panicked, couldn't figure out how to shut it off, and it turned them off of screen readers forever. So before you turn on a screen reader for the first time, figure out what your escape hatches are. In the case of VoiceOver, you have two options. If you just want it to shut up whatever it's saying, right? Like stop saying whatever it's saying, you can always hit Control. If you want to turn off VoiceOver altogether, there's this little X in the corner. You can just click that and it turns off. So those are your escape hatches for VoiceOver. Control to just get it to shut up with whatever it's currently saying, and then click that little X to turn it off. With that in mind, let's take a look at how we can navigate a page.
VoiceOver on system preferences.
Okay.
Recipe list, stylish magazine.
So I'm going to introduce you to a few navigation modes. The first is the one that's going to be most intuitive to us developers, and it's also the one that's least commonly used by screen reader users. So this is tabbing to navigate. So tabbing moves the keyboard focus, moves basically the keyboard cursor to different interactive elements on the page. And so that's going to be your links, buttons, and form fields. This is, that's the same as, if you're tabbing when you don't have a screen reader active. So again, tabbing is just for focusable, like keyboard interactive things. And because of that, most content actually isn't keyboard interactive. So it's the least commonly used navigation mode. But I'm going to, let me turn on the little key command preview thing. So I'm going to tab a few times and we'll see kind of what happens.
This unlabeled image, unlabeled image. To get missing image descriptions, open the context menu. Chrome has new window.
So already we're seeing something interesting here, which is that the word recipe list, this isn't actually text. This is an image, and an image that doesn't actually tell screen reader users that it's the words recipe list. So already we've got a bit of a problem, but okay, let me keep tapping.
Link, view recipes. Visited, link, home, list 5 items. Link, recipes. Link, restaurants. Link, kitchenware. Visited, link, contact me. Visited, link, vague. Visited, link, eggplant meatball. You are current. Visited, link, 18 July 2017. You are current.
Okay, so if I wanted to backtrack, I could do Shift Tab.
Visited, link, eggplant meatball. Visited, link, vague. You are currently on a link.
All right, so that's tabbing. Again, that is purely for interactive things, right? So if you can interact with it with your keyboard, it needs to be tabbable. You need to be able to tab to it. And there's a general heuristic that if you can interact with it with your mouse, you should be able to interact with it with your keyboard. So that's the kind of chain. You can do it with your mouse, so you should be able to do it with your keyboard. If you can do it with your keyboard, it needs to be tappable. So yeah, that's the first form of screen reader navigation to introduce you to. The next thing is, you know, I mentioned that tapping only goes to interactive elements. What if you want just any kind of element? Well, screen readers have a navigation mode called the virtual cursor. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to go to one of these pages that's very content heavy.
Visited. Entering map. List 5 items.
Okay.
Visited. Link.
So I'm just
Has new.
going to skip us down here, further down, and then I'll start demonstrating. Okay. So to use the virtual cursor for voiceover, I'm going to do Control, Option, and then the left and right arrow keys.
Level 3. Maze has non-compound spawn. Don't have mechanisms to set yourselves to normal mares. You will use non-fundamental words.
And that sounds like gibberish, but that's because it's actually reading lorem ipsum, which is gibberish. So, you know, if I'd done like, if I started over here on the right.
Search on this. Heading level 2. Search. Search on the site. Edit text. Blank. Heading level 2. Recent posts. Blank. Heading level 5. 5 beautiful buildings you need to before dying.
All right. So that's the virtual cursor. Now you might imagine that if you're clicking the, you know, the arrow keys a whole bunch of times, that could get tedious. What if you just, you know, you want to read this blog post or whatever, you just want to start at the beginning and just keep, keep going, right? You can activate what's called continuous reading mode. So I'm going to do, I'm going to start here, and then I'm going to do Control Option A.
Has new in models for informatics. More connected bioculus. Link. By end of in models for informatics. More connected bioculus. By end of Ultras is Noah.
And it's just going to keep going through the page. And so that's navigating with the virtual cursor and with continuous reading mode. And so that's how you'd get to like everything on the page, static, interactive, whatever. But there's one more navigation mode for screen readers that you should know about. If you're using JAWS and NVDA, unfortunately, you're not going to get the nice display we're about to get. But instead, JAWS and NVDA support this with a just whole metric ton of keyboard shortcuts. I think VoiceOver has it easier because it's just one pane. The shortcuts are far easier. So this is what these screen readers all support is the ability to hop between different elements of a similar type. And so we're going to see this in play. So I'm going to do Control Option U. And you can see now that I'm actually on a little readout of all the headings on my page. So every H1 through H6.
Heading level 2, 3 items. Blog. No Ferris Eros. Various Cinemet Blog at 9. Chrome has new heading level 3. Quick and easy homemade pizza recipe. Heading level 3. Maze has non-compound spawn.
All right. If I do the left and right arrow keys, I can go to different panes.
Form controls menu.
So these are my buttons.
No items in res. No items in landmarks menu. Articles menu. Images menu.
Here's all my images, and here we see we've got a bit of a problem because none of these images have anything descriptive at all. So this is an issue that we would want to resolve with the images alt attribute. You can see that in lieu of any descriptive text, in some cases, it is taken to using the source attribute. So anyone who's ever seen an ugly source attribute, an ugly URL for a source attribute, should probably be very, very wary of allowing the source to be like the descriptive image here. There we go. So these images that's describing here are like this guy over here and down here, so etc. Right? So we can get the point here is that we can skip between different elements of a similar type, and this also impacts how we should expect that users could navigate our page. Like take for instance the fact that we could just go from heading to heading. This is all of these numbers are indicating like whether it was an H2 or an H3 and so forth. And as you can see, first of all, there's a ton of headings and there maybe shouldn't be that many. But the fact that this view exists is indicative of something. So if you and I are sighted, we might skim through a page to get through the information we want. But if you're using a screen reader, it's very linear. You have to trudge through a lot of content before you get to what you want. And so screen reader users very often will navigate from heading to heading to get a sense of the page structure so that they can skip to where it is they want to go. But to do that, they need to like kind of build this mental model of how the page is actually structured. And so our headings need to reflect the page structure. So a takeaway from this is don't use H1 through H6 for like big text, but rather because you're indicating the structure of the page. And so the way this works is like your page title should be your H1. You should have exactly one H1, and it should be basically your page title. And then anything that's like a subsection of that page, you should have an H2 for. And if that subsection has its own subsection, you describe that with an H3. And so you end up with an outline structure that feels a lot more like if you're writing a like bulleted outline for an essay more than anything. And that's what time and time again has been shown to be an intuitive way for screen reader users to understand your page. Similarly, the
Form controls menu. No items.
the
Images menu. Notes. Links menu.
here's a view where we can see all the links that are on the page. As you can imagine, these links are being viewed completely out of context, right? Like if this link was part of a bigger paragraph, you would be none the wiser because here it's presented completely divorced of context. And so one thing that's important for us to do is to make sure that our link text could be understandable completely without context. Because that is a very valid way for screen reader users to navigate our page. So if you ever see a link where the text is click here or read more, like that's too generic. That doesn't give the intent of the link. So you should restructure your links to better reflect that context. Yeah, here's an example of a link that just says here, like that right there is just too vague. Any questions about any of this so far? Cool. All right. In that case, I know we're running out of time. So I just want to show y'all one more thing, which is,
Voiceover off.
obviously, like this is barely scratching the surface of accessibility. If you are interested in solving accessibility issues, you're generally like, you're not going to immediately know where to start, right? There's so many different kinds of disabilities to account for and so many different things. Like, how do you figure out, like your website could have tons of defects. Like, where do you start? And one thing I recommend is installing a tool like DevTools. This is a tool that will scan your page and let you know what automatically detectable accessibility issues exist on that page. So you can find it in the Chrome extensions web store. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the inspector here. I've got this like tab here that says DevTools. I'm going to click scan all of my page. And this is going to scan the page. It's going to tell me what automatically detectable accessibility issues exist on the page. So that's an important thing to note because not every accessibility issue is automatically detectable. There are some that certainly are, like things like color contrast are automatically detectable. But some accessibility issues that you might encounter are like higher level usability issues where it's like hard for a computer to definitively say one way or another. I don't actually know why this is going so slowly. Interesting. There we go. So this has told me about a bunch of different issues that exist on the page. Now, the vast majority of them, like a lot of them are like color contrast issues, which we've already talked about. But then there's one like, HTML element must have a lang attribute. So if you don't know, that's an element or that's an attribute that exists on the HTML element that tells you what the page language is. And you might be thinking, wait a second, why is that an accessibility issue? Well, after this is surfaced, what I recommend doing is clicking the more info link up here. It'll take you to DQ's resource on, hey, what is this? Why is this an issue? Who is this for? Like it'll tell you like why it matters, stuff like that. Another thing it'll tell you is, trying to find it. Here we go. So over here on the right-hand corner, it'll tell you something known as WCAG success criterion. So there is an industry standard set of accessibility requirements. These are the industry standard and legal standard for accessibility compliance. And these are known as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And they're put forth by the World Wide Web Consortium, which is the same organization that puts together like the standards for like HTML and CSS and stuff like that. So it's basically a bunch of like kind of pass-fail statements about the accessibility of a page. So here it's telling us that there is this criterion 3.1.1 language of page. And so let's take a look at this. Let's try to understand what's going on here. So I'm going to Google, and I happen to know that WCAG 2.2 is coming out soon enough that I'm just going to recommend y'all start there. even though the current version is WCAG 2.1. But it's a big old document. I don't recommend memorizing this, but instead just kind of Googling WCAG and then some UI problem that you have and seeing if anything comes up on here. But this is a big old set of guidelines that we have to follow, and it's broken down by 4 principles. So web content must be 1, perceivable, 2, operable, 3, understandable, and 4, robust. It has definitions for all of those. But if we go looking for 3.1.1, we see that it's part of the understandable principle. So our content needs to be understandable for disabled people. It needs to be readable. And then here's this like pass fail. This is the actual like requirement that's being infringed, this language of page. And it says the default human language of each web page can be programmatically determined. If you're like, hey, what does any of that mean? Like, why is that important? There's this tiny little link here that if I just open up in a new tab, it gives you even more context, which is fantastic. It tells you like who this is for, why it exists. Another thing to call out is you'll see that there's this level A, level AA, and level AAA. These are the 3 tiers of conformance. So A is the least strict, AA is the medium strict, and then AAA is very, very strict and not inherently possible for all kinds of media. So the industry and legal standard for web accessibility compliance is AA, which means you have to meet all level A and level AA requirements on this page. That applies to basically any public website. So if you're ever looking for like, hey, what requirements am I held to? That's what this is. And so I recommend when you're starting out with accessibility, going through the automated testing tools like AxDev tools, seeing what issues it surfaces, and then go research those issues, figure out why they're issues, figure out like what access needs you could actually improve, and then go see if you can hunt down like the underlying requirements as well. But yeah, so I apologize. This has just barely scratched the surface, but I hope that this has given y'all kind of like a starting point to thinking like an accessibility practitioner in terms of like who we're building for and kind of how we approach a problem and stuff like that. Are there any questions? Anything y'all want to know?
I had a question.
Go for it.
The tools that you're like presenting as far like stuff like Lighthouse or whatever, stuff that like automatically kind of goes through and checks your site or whatever, does that take the place? Like I was just thinking about end-to-end testing and like, do you need different flows for like different like situations or different disabilities? Like, or could do those tools kind of take the place of like handling the, like, you know, different flows or whatever?
That's a fantastic question. So the way I see it, you still need manual testing. You will, because accessibility is usability and you can't automation test away every usability concern, right? Where automated accessibility testing tools like AxDev tools or Chrome Lighthouse, what those are really good for is regression. So things like color contrast, right? That would be a waste of time for developers to have to test every time they release something, right? Like we can all agree that would be incredibly tedious. If you have testers or like if you have a QA team or if you have developers constantly validating that, they should be focusing on more productive problems, right? But we still want to make sure that those things are squared away. So automated testing can be really good for solving those things. It can be really good for telling you, hey, your images are missing alt text. But what it can't do is tell you if the alt text that you've provided is any good, if it's accurate, if it's helpful and useful, right? And so that's where, you know, a lot of like usability problems are kind of higher order thinking, you know, they're not always things that you could like pass fail or even like write a computer check for, right? An automated check for. So the way I like to see it is absolutely like incorporate automated testing tools, use that to supplement your manual testing and to ensure that you don't fall behind, you don't encounter regression, but it's never going to fully take the place of manual testing. So yeah, that would be the just my general guidance there. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, and absolutely there are automated accessibility tools that will fit into just about any like end-to-end testing that you've got. Things like I believe Cypress has like accessibility plugins. There's if you're big on continuous integration and continuous deployment, the engine that powers Axe DevTools is called Axe Core, and you can run it in the command line. And that means you can run it in your pipelines. So you could install Axe Core and run that in your pipelines against your website, for instance. And so there are absolutely things you can do to automate away a lot of concerns. But a lot of accessibility defects come down to like, is such and such thing intuitive, right? And you can't automate that away. So automate away the regression and the easily lintable things, freeing up your developers, your QA teams, your accessibility folks to think about higher level problem solving. So fantastic question, Clint. Thank you. Any other questions? All right. Well, I want to, in that case, thank you all for being here. I wanted to encourage y'all to come find me all the places. Namely, I tweet. Come follow me on Twitter at benmyers. I stream accessibility stuff as well. I usually have guests, and we usually tackle like individual kind of aspects of accessibility. So much more focused on like kind of individual pieces there, but you can go follow there. I do weekly streams Tuesdays at 2 p.m. So reach out if you have any questions or want to know any more or anything like that. And I'd love to see y'all around. And thanks for having me, y'all.